Okay, everyone, I am the pre-lunch talk here today, so I appreciate everybody bearing with me. So inspiring to hear Martha and Justin's talks earlier. I think I have 10 pages of notes from this morning already, things I would, if I could, and maybe will, incorporate into the talk as they're relevant. I'm going to keep track of each section's time up here. Time is very important. The Jonathan Bayliss Society's timing is much better than the Charles Olson Society's timing, and I think it reflects the folks that are honored by those organizations. I want to start by thanking Catherine Bayliss and the Jonathan Bayliss Society for asking me to be here today. In late spring, Catherine reached out and asked if I would give a talk on September 6th, which was so far away at the time, focusing on three of Jonathan Bayliss's literary contemporaries, Charles Olson, Joseph Garland, and Peter Anastas. For each of these writers, Gloucester Harbor, the topic of this year's conference, is an abiding concern and a generative source. Catherine's request came to me at a time when I was getting ready to return to teaching English at Gloucester High School after 9 years as the principal of Gloucester High School. So it was after 9 years of daily responsibility for not only the students' education, but also their safety and well-being, 9 years of navigating the pandemic, a strike, at least 3 significant budget cuts, navigating relationships with politicians, including Greg, who was here earlier, and Greg's predecessor, politicians, police, lawyers, during highly charged crises. Some were public and some known only to the participants. After a great many losses, including tragic deaths and quite a few successes, so after an all-consuming 9-year immersion in public service, I was reasonably worried about returning so quickly to my previous literary avocation, which included giving talks like this one. So despite feeling a tremendous amount of anxiety about this talk, feeling rusty and out of shape, so to speak, and perhaps not being at the moment quite the right person for a talk like this, I nevertheless said yes. As a way to spur my return to active participation in literary and artistic life here in Gloucester, and as a kind of homecoming, returning to formative texts and central concerns while also branching out into some new ground, as I'll make clear later. So, in the spirit of Charles Olson's improvised lectures and Jonathan Bayliss's curricula and syllabi, there are several pathways through the material I'll cover today, but only one of these will happen. So in the pivot to more literary engagement, I haven't left behind public service and civic engagement. So I've titled this talk, Harborside Civics Lessons, Gloucester Harbor in the Political Imagination of Gloucester Writers, in hopes that it would help me stay true to my abiding concerns and to stay focused. The title narrows the geography. I'll try to stay focused on the harbor, meaning the body of water, but also the downtown section of the city. Per Joseph Garland in Guns Off Gloucester, quote, "Everybody called the thickest part of town the harbor." As a brief aside, I wish we restored that convention, calling this area the harbor, instead of renaming it that twee neonym Harbor Town for the cultural district designation. Harbor, we can do that, right? So a lot of us here, we have influence, we'll just call it harbor and forget this Harbor Town stuff. Okay, but I digress, all right. The title also further helped me narrow the focus to the political imagination. So that these are folks who are imagining what has been and what could be. So in selecting the text to share this morning, I hope to prefer and choose the evocative, the suggestive, the myth-making, the image-making, and the storytelling to the didactic, despite the word lesson, which is there as a cheeky wink to my profession as a teacher, I'm a writer, and I've been a principal, but I'm proudly a teacher first. So, each of the writers I'll discuss today, one, has at different times and in different ways centered the harbor in his work. Two, has done so in ways that are both strikingly different and curiously overlapping. And three, has gone beyond standard literary production and publication in an attempt to more directly influence the harbor's present and future by engaging with each other and with the community, by publishing columns and letters in the Gloucester Daily Times, and by engaging with local politics. This talk will be a study of harbor-based civics lessons in the work of these writers. And in this talk, I'll also touch upon a few other Gloucester writers of the same time period and bring things up to the current moment by situating some present-day makers, two people I know really well, in relation to Olson, Garland, and Anastas' harbor lessons. So by examining our unique heritage of civically engaged writers with regional, national, or international reputations, who also engage with each other and the public at large over the local issues of the harbor, including, the fate of this harbor and its uses, I hope to today spur our own further engagement and future engagement with not only these writers, but also in an ongoing way draw from the writers to find exhortation and exhaustion, admittedly, exemplar and error, dedication and some dead ends, as well as invitations and rebukes that relate to our own social, political engagement with the harbor, the city, each other, and various projections beyond the immediately walkable, swimmable, paddleable, sailable, inhabitable, and knowable. So this talk will be about civics lessons in several senses, and it'll proceed in the spirit of Charles Olson's rendering of the word history, which for him goes back to its Greek origins, and he takes it as a verb meaning to find out for oneself, as Justin has done so much of this morning, which was so inspiring, by the way. That was amazing. So I'm not a scholar or historian, and I'm just returning to a lot of this material this summer, and there's been a lot of discovery as I've attempted to find out for myself through dozens of sources, more than 1,000 pages of reading and rereading. So this is not going to be comprehensive. It's not the most well-designed thing I've ever created, but I humbly offer this talk for your interest and for your use. All right, there are a few questions to consider when we think about civic engagement in Gloucester in this literature related to the harbor. How in our public life do we act on what has value? What constitutes truly and ethically inhabiting a place alongside fellow citizens? What is right living in relation to others? And what are our obligations of service? And before turning to Olson, Garland, and Anastas' work, there's one more frame I want to add for you. And it's a bit of a digression, but I think it's worthwhile and adds value. And I needed this frame in order to look at these writers with new eyes after being away from them for so long. So this quote that I'll share with you is from the introduction to the collected poems of Thich Nhat Hanh. And it's by Ocean Vuong, who is one of the greatest contemporary writers in America, lives out in Western Mass. Won the T.S. Eliot Prize for Poetry and the New England Book Award for Fiction. And this is what he says about civically engaged poetry in referring to Thich Nhat Hanh. It is no coincidence that one of modern history's most iconic teachers would use poetry as a medium for sharing and exploring the wisdom inherent in the human condition. We discover in the poetic texts one central bond, the enacting of the poem as a vehicle for civic engagement, not as polemic, but as robust and complex architectures wherein the role of the citizen is made capacious and vexed. Keep coming back to those words in the talk. Capacious and vexed in relation to society. In other words, the work of poetry has always been the work of interbeing. So I cite Vuong's words about the great spiritual leader of the Vietnamese engaged Buddhism tradition as a way to situate the discussion of civic engagement, both within Gloucester and simultaneously within the larger context of literature of interbeing, in hopes that here in Gloucester, works incorporating the capacious but vexed role of the citizen allow us to live both in our wards and precincts, but also in heaven simultaneously. That's one of Olson's concepts that he wrote in a letter to Joe Garland. To live in your ward and in heaven simultaneously. All right. So that's as good a place as any. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Because my time's telling me to. That's as good a place as any to begin examining Charles Olson's Harborside civic lesson. We'll start at the beginning with some abbreviated context for Olson's passion for Harborside civics. So here's a little quick line for folks who don't know Olson well. Olson is born in 1910 in Worcester. In 1915, Olson's family begins summering in Gloucester in a cabin on the edge of Stagefort Park, which gets him to the harbor for the first time. Olson attends Worcester Classical High School during the school year, where he is class president and where he becomes a national debate contest winner, gets a prize of getting to go to Europe out of this thing. And the early Maximus poems, as we'll see, bear the mark of a debater. During summers, he works for the Gloucester Post Office during the summers while he's attending Wesleyan. His dad dies in 1935, and his mom begins living here in Gloucester year-round. In 1936, Olson spends 3 weeks working on a sword fishing boat from out of right near here, which is referred to in the poem I'll present later. Then, turning to civics again, beginning in 1941, he begins his political work. First in New York for the ACLU, and then the Common Council on American Unity, then in Washington, D.C. for the Foreign Language Division of the Office of War Information in 1942, and in 1944 becomes the director of the Democratic National Committee's Foreign Nationalities Division. So this work relates in particular to his emphasis on heterogeneity, that Gloucester can know polis, can know what it is to be a community of manifest, interactive people, because we are a mixture, right? You can see that in the political work that comes before that, and that shows up in the Maximus poems. In the 1950s, he begins the Maximus poems directed to Gloucester, but he's outside of Gloucester at this time. And it isn't until he comes back then in 1957 to live at 28 Fort Square after Black Mountain College closes, where he's taught and been the rector when the school closes down. And he re-engages directly with the harbor and the life of the city. In 1961, urban renewal is first proposed. Olson calls it, in Peter Anastas' memory, hearing him, renewing without reviewing. In 1964, only the Fitz Lane house is saved from destruction of the housing nearby, as we saw earlier. And through the Gloucester Daily Times in 1965 to 1968, Olson calls for the preservation of a whole bunch of places, and he fails. Solomon Davis House on Middle Street, which became the Y, which for my children and their upbringing was probably a good thing. The Parson Morse House on Western Avenue and the Mansfield House on Main Street, all taken down for new construction. We'll refer to that a little bit later. Olson dies in 1970. So I think I'll be cutting things a little bit today, and I'm going to be presenting one of the Maximus poems today. So in the 3 volumes of the Maximus poems, right, all poems focused on Gloucester, all related to the topic of today, civic engagement, and related to the capacious and vexed role of the citizen. In the first volume of the Maximus poems, we find bitter laments and hectoring polemic. He's telling Gloucester what to do, what we should be doing, how we need to resist what the country is becoming. In the second volume, we find a move from the harbor into Dogtown, and that is the vantage, and an increase in myth and myth-making. And in the third volume, which was assembled after Olson died, from fragments he left, we find more lyricism and equanimity in the fragments. And it's from this era that that phrase, being in Ward 4 and heaven simultaneously, comes from there. And Joe Garland quotes it in something he writes. It's in a letter to Joe, and he quotes it when he writes a eulogistic column a year after Olson dies. It's no longer Ward 4 there, by the way. It's Ward 2, Precinct 2. But anyway, all right. So I'm going to skip some of the, in bringing Olson to folks who might not be as familiar with his work, I want to go into letter 6, which is, of the early poems, the one that is most generous, right? Least yelling at Gloucester and telling us what to do. I don't want to be told, I'm too old for that. So letter 6 is my favorite of the early Maximus poems. It has more story in it. And though it includes complaint, it also shows a way forward. And that way forward is attention and care. I love that. I use that all the time in my speeches to my students, graduation and all that. All right, so here's the poem. And I'll comment along the way, kind of pausing. Letter 6, Polis is eyes. And so by introducing the idea that in order to have civic life, we have to see it ourselves. We have to see it. We have to be there to see it. Then he indents the poem, and he goes into a story about the captain on the sword fishing vessel I just mentioned, Moulton. Moulton cried up that day, "Where'd you get those glasses?" After, like a greenhorn, I'd picked 3 swordfish out of the blaze of sun, where no regular could afford to look, to waste his eyes seeking a fin in that place. Olson had great success when he went out, but he was doing things that none of them would do, right? He's looking right into the sun, where you'd hurt your eyes if you did that all the time. But he gets beginner's luck, right? And he's referring back to that story. I have suffered since from that enthusiasm, as my heart has never been so good as the day I'd be damned if that Englishman and mountain climber would beat me up the Bright Angel Trail. I'd been the cannier in the descent, had a chocolate bar we all ate as we cooled our feet in the Colorado. It was coming up. I spent myself, falling face flat, each step I managed, flopping in the fine dust, which mules, wiser and wealthier persons rode, had ground the sandstone to. He's remembering another time, right, that he had too much enthusiasm. It is just such folly is not necessary, yet I have not noticed that those who are shot haven't got that way by pushing their limits. He goes back to remembering his sword fishing trip from right out of here. Above me, when Moulton hollered from the wheel, was Burke, humped over the masthead like the ball on top of the weather pole. He squatting in the canvas strap. The rest of us standing in the whale rope rigging, all of us, like birds in a coat. And he, the leader, as well as he was that good a professional, his eyes as gulls are, or any Portuguese, and the long visor of his cap more of a beak than ever, the same we all wore. It is of the matter that this Burke on land was a drunk, though one Sunday I did see him on the wharf with his kids, showing them the vessel, he in a blue suit in the old stiff straw, the only time I did see him so, like the oval portrait hangs in so many living rooms. Not at all the same grace of a man came up on the deck at sea in oilskins, as Olson, 2 days out, would appear in a new white shirt and new fedora, Hyperion to the lump his men would have wheeled aboard at sailing time in a barrow, right? Contrasting the man at sea and that skill with what he saw on land. It makes sense that these men, Burke was raising his family in a shack out over the marsh, and Olson, they now tell me, is carting fish for Gorton Pugh, the lowest job, Gloucester, the job we all started with. Young Douglas, who never went to sea, he's different, is in the front office at Gorton Pugh, was so good a ball player, he got moved up fast. And here's Olson lamenting, right? The person who gets ahead is the person who plays ball in the corporate room, not the person who's great at the job at sea. He gave me cans of cooked mackerel the last time I was home for the ride back, he said. And I couldn't tell him I hate picnics. Picnics, Pound roared, and he's remembering the story with Ezra Pound. I'm actually going to skip that part right now to get to the end in interest of time. Olson now comes to his point. Eyes and polis, fishermen and poets. He's making a connection between these are the people who really see the city, fishermen and poets. Or in every human head I've ever known is busy, both the attention and the care, however much each of us chooses our own kin and concentration. So attention and care is the lesson Olson has for us. And that can be the artist, the poet. We saw the visual artist earlier paying close attention. We've heard historians doing that today, paying that close attention. And the fishermen, the people who are working, who need to know, who need to be skilled at this work, that and not in abstraction is where is the civics lesson that Olson is bringing to us. All right, so I'm going to skip here to the end, though there's super interesting, actually stuff that totally relates to things you were talking about here, about the ships that were coming out. So I'm going to skip that for the moment to keep going here. So Olson ends, there are no hierarchies, no infinite, no such many as mass. Those two lines, by the way, no infinite, no such many as mass, are both veiled attacks on Vincent Farini that I won't explain right now, but anyway, they're attacks on him. He's more direct in attacking him in letter 5, which came before this. There are no hierarchies, no infinite, no such many as mass. There are only eyes in all heads to be looked out of. So that's our charge and our responsibility. Or that's how I've taken it as a kind of credo my whole life. It's something I've been bringing to my students. So whoever we are, poets and fishermen, teachers, chefs, builders, nurses, yoga instructors, gardeners, custodians, policemen, each of us has to do the work with attention and care every day. There's no shortcuts to the work. There can be no profiteering. There's no way out but through. Work is the thing, and it's exhausting and frustrating, deeply frustrating when it's not given the money back, as he gives many examples of throughout his poems, but it's in the work that polis comes. All right, we're gonna move quickly past something about him being capacious. So I'll just briefly say that the Maximus figure, Olson is seeking that each of us in our lives inhabits a kind of grand myth or narrative of each of our lives as a Maximus, right? That things are big. He feels that in modern life that there's a narrowing through kind of bureaucratic living. And he sees here on the harbor with the fishermen and in his own experience and later in life this sense of size and magnitude that he's seeking. So that word capacious really stood out to me from Vong. But it's a vexed relationship. Olson later says, an American is a complex of occasions, themselves a geometry of spatial nature. I have this sense that I'm one with my skin, plus this, that forever the geography which leans in on me, I compel backwards. I compel Gloucester to yield, to change. Polis is this. So you can see the pushing for capacious life, for capaciousness, the enlarging of the citizen and the role but it's in a vexation, it's with a conflict with the city that one is in. At this point, I'm going to pivot between Olson and Joe Garland. And to do so, I'm going to return to Charles Olson's letters to the Gloucester Daily Times. So in the Gloucester Daily Times, Charles Olson is writing these sort of defenses of, he's trying to preserve these places in Gloucester, and Garland hilariously responds to him. I don't know if folks are familiar with these, but they're great. So Joe writes back, Olson's at it again. The prophet without, this is in the newspaper. Olson's at it again. The prophet without honor, the Jeremiah of the fort, Quixote of Gloucester. I read you, Charles, and then he addresses him directly, like Olson does to all of us in the Maximus poems. I read you, Charles, I do. Poet, leave us alone, will you? But it turns out in the private letters that follow this, like 2 days later, Charles writes, and they go on, they're going back and forth. But it's super friendly, Because what it is the actual thing is that Joe is just critical of Charles for not being effective. You haven't organized anything. How are you going to get it done? Right? Like, how are you going to save these things? You can't just go complaining about it and putting the pressure on us. You got to like get together with people and organize, right? Joe's saying this in fewer words than I'm saying them now, but sharply. He says even directly, no points of difference at all. Probably what I really mean is that unorganized efforts to save won't be successful, right? And he goes on to talk about that. So, it's a really interesting kind of back and forth between the two of them that I love, because they're both historians, right? They're both digging deep into material. And the sort of the last part for Joe Garland that I wanted to touch on, because there's so much, right, harbor-related stuff, is that Olson, 2 years before, had given Joe advice about how to be a historian, right? Yeah, I know, right? So 1966, Olson gives Joe advice to put more of yourself in the work, is the simple version of it, right? You're telling these stories, but there's no like take on it, right? And it's interesting because Joe responds by saying like, I've been stewing over that. Like, I'm thinking about what you've been saying. I don't have an answer yet. Because what Joe's doing at the time is he's struggling to create Guns Off Gloucester. And he's really wrestling with this stuff. And what he writes in the book is in the letters is interesting because it's clear that the book is really different in what it becomes than in this moment of research when he's writing to Olson. Like, he hasn't found the story yet. But I think there are two ways that Joe Garland does put himself into Guns Off Gloucester. And one is this real obsession with the medical situation in Gloucester in the Revolutionary War period, or the lead up to. And we know, like, Joe's family, for those of you who know Joe, his grandfather's a physician, and he wrote 3 books on medical institutions before turning his attention to Gloucester. Really interesting, including Mass General Hospital, right? And you see that showing up in his coverage of Gloucester at this time. Like, the breakouts of smallpox have he talks a lot about them here. And it's really interesting to put yourself in the shoes of what it would have been like in a small community to have an outbreak, right? And how do we do isolation, things we're familiar with, right? It's so fascinating to look through the perspective of the pandemic back onto Gloucester at that time period in the mid 18th century. And Joe is into it because, he's into the kind of the medical situation. So he does put himself into the book, as Olson suggests. And secondly, he tells these amazing stories in which the heroes of the ultimate encounter with the Falcon, which I won't get into today, but it's a fascinating book, and it's timely, right, as we turn to the 250th anniversary of many of these events. What's to me more interesting is he really paints the picture. So many of those guys were smugglers and thugs. Like, if you were a loyalist, right, they're dragging you out of your house, dragging you down Middle Street, and I have this great picture. One time, in a wheelbarrow, from house to house, where you have to admit to each family along the way, this is who I am. I'm against this community, and I'm, loyal to the crown, and this sort of thing. This is before the war actually begins. And Joe is really clear, and his politics really come through, that this sort of mob thuggery is not cool with him, even though these people become our Revolutionary War heroes. And again, looking at it through contemporary eyes of this kind of going rogue and turning to mob sort of violence in our, what's happened right here in our streets, was really, something where I could hear Joe's voice, really hear him come through. So I do think, that's present in what Olson had said to him in these letters. He is there. Joe is there and in these books. All right, so in pivoting, it was interesting, as I was reading Guns Off Gloucester, I'd also simultaneously started Peter's book, Decline of Fishes, in which he talks about, the proposal to build a mall on I-4C2 and the debate over that and stopping that from happening. And interestingly, I was reading that simultaneous to Captain Foster buying the property, the same area. Of course, it's built up and it's different, but that same general area of the harbor he had just bought for his wharf. And Joe's talking about its uses in the late 20th century, and here I am reading Joe and talking about that wharf in the mid 18th century. So, coming over to Peter, Peter, it's so hard to reread in some ways because of my relationship with Peter. I could really hear his voice the entire time that I was reading and really focus on reading his novel, Decline of Fishes. He really struggles with his relationship with the harbor in this book because on the one hand, there's this real desire to preserve something, the working waterfront, right? But he is also, through his social work, so aware of the harms, the secondary harms of the industry on family life, right? And really lives that. Broken Trip and At the Cut, we see these stories as well played out in those two works. But I turned to Decline of Fishes, though, instead of Broken Trip and At the Cut, to really focus on a few things. One is Peter uses this figure of Laurie in the novel. This is Decline of Fishes. Laurie is a reporter for the Gloucester Daily Times, and she is has grown up in Gloucester and is really wrestling with her own broken family life. And in this beautiful passage in the book, Peter has set up the top of the page is a dialogue between Laurie and her sister, who's in Riverdale Park. And the bottom of the page is a column, fictional column, in the Gloucester Daily Times that Laurie has written, in which she explores sort of broken lives in America at the same time. And what Laurie has done is, through Jason, who is the Peter surrogate, the Peter figure in the book, Laurie, through Jason, has begun to return to sort of thinking through what it means to be a citizen here and what it means to be in a place and how to be a force of allowing people to really live and inhabit that place as, quote, live goods. And so Laurie becomes this way of moving towards capaciousness, right? Growing from being limited by your circumstances to something larger than that. I don't have time I want to wrap this up now, but I believe that turning to Decline of Fishes for this topic, and knowing Peter as he was composing this, moved by, for all three of these writers, the essential use of our local newspaper as a place to play out civic identity, right? The disagreements that they had with each other, even as their work is overlapping. And each of these writers also had a real influence on now, right? So two people that I know really well, one of my best friends, David Rich, and my wife, Amanda Cook, are both engaged in various projects and have been at times that take the work of these three writers and bring them right up to our present day. One place I will point people towards is David Rich's talk, Charles Olson, Newman Shea, and the Fishing Strike of 1917, which Cape Ann Museum, I was able to get the transcript of it online just through a quick search, in which he takes some of what Olson observes about the harbor and sees where it's even more vexed than Olson has it, especially in regard to labor history and the role of workers getting together and organizing. Peter's book has chapters devoted to kind of like a song of organizing, like how important it is to organize with other people. There are whole passages to this, and some of you might even be in the book with other names, right? It just changes names of people. whereas Olson wasn't organizing, that was Garland's critique, right? Peter's really showing a song of that. And then David Rich in his work through this fisherman Newman Shea, who shows up in Charles Olson's Maximus poems, but Shea is a much deeper figure as this labor organizer with a tragic outcome than is seen in the Maximus poems. But it shows, again, this idea of our relationship, our civic relationship. There's so much more, but I want to end with my wife, Amanda Cook's work. She is doing something crazy right now. She is 2/3 of the way through a poem-for-poem response to the Maximus poems. Every single poem, she's responding to it with a poem. And so taking Olson to task for various things, connecting on various things, but also putting life now, mostly what it's about is putting life now in the book, in the harbor now. So I've just picked out a few passages to share with you to end this. It's being the poems are being serialized by a magazine called Spoke. Amanda's right now working on the 3rd volume of the Maximus poems, but has written the response in the first 2, and they've appeared in this magazine Spoke in print. So I just wanted to share a few to bring us up to date. This is what Amanda says about the project. I didn't know it, but I have a lot to say to Charles Olson. My reactions have become personal, a sort of conversation between me and Olson. They are, just as Maximus was, shaped by what is happening in our world, in our city, in our eyes. These poems are written after mass shootings, around protests, and the Me Too movement. These poems are written as I raise my children. Now they're adults. They do come visit. Letter 6. So this is her response to the letter I read earlier. I walked away from this for a long time. I come back angry. It's not that I think you are the problem. I can't separate you from the problem. I can't write this unless I'm alone. Do you know how hard it is to be alone these days? Years ago, my brother spent his nights sleeping on the deck of an open boat, alone, out at sea, waiting to catch a tuna. One night, he showed up with a block of meat, bloody and red, from just behind the fish's head. The rest he sold at auction. Does he have polis in his eyes? He never had any money to pour back into his boat. He raises his family in a small house looking over the city from the edge of Dogtown. Yesterday, we went to a rally on the grounds of the Meeting House on Middle Street. A young girl stood waiting her turn as old white men walked with determination to the front of the rally and took the microphone before her. Do they have polis in their eyes? Eyes and polis, fishermen and poets. This morning, the air was so cold, the harbor was full of sea smoke. It rose around 10-Pound Island, meeting the clouds that hung at the horizon. I drove home knowing there was a pot of hot coffee. Just 2 more little sections, but I think you'll get the flavor. Like you, we are afraid of losing Gloucester. Each of us with our own secret Gloucester to save, each digging in his heels. But Gloucester is bigger than my secrets or Farini's little house. It is bigger than your poems. And finally, Maximus to Gloucester, 27 withheld. This is her response to the other poem I read earlier. For my 16 years, I stood facing out. Sorry, let me start that again. For my first 16 years, I stood facing outward, facing the sea, the city at my back. How wide open it all was. A turn, a click almost, like some machine, set me in another direction. I have been city since. I know it better than the back of my hand. Your city, my city, there is something sticky about it. I have to check myself, check my sentimentality when I balk at change. What are we sweeping under the rug? What will we uncover? I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, everybody.